When people today imagine medieval knights, they often picture noble warriors in shining armor, sworn to protect the weak and fight with honor. This image has been shaped by literature, art, and later romantic traditions, rather than by the realities of the Middle Ages. In truth, knights were not always noble defenders. They were feudal enforcers, soldiers of fortune, and sometimes ruthless opportunists. Their lives were defined by politics, money, and survival, as much as by ideals. The gap between the legend and the reality is wide, and understanding it reveals a far more complex and human story than the polished myths we inherited. Number 1. Feudal enforcers, not noble heroes. When you take a closer look at medieval knights, the familiar image of honorable champions dissolves into something far more pragmatic and often grim. Knights weren't gentle guardians of virtue. More commonly, they were armed enforcers of the feudal system, wielding power on behalf of their lords, and sometimes serving more as oppressors than protectors. Their role began in a landscape reshaped by feudalism, where land was exchanged for service. Lords granted estates, or fiefs, to knights in return for military duty, and little else was required from the lower classes. These knights didn't simply ride to battle. They administered estates, managed finances, and ensured rent and taxes were extracted from peasants, often by force. In many cases, their authority was backed by violence rather than respect. What's less romantic is how knights could incorporate plunder and intimidation into official duties. Wars or feudal conflicts allowed them, or even expected them to wage chevauchée, raids that burned villages, stole livestock, and terrorized rural areas. This practice aimed to weaken the enemy's resources and morale, and wasn't reserved for foreign foes. It occurred to subjects as well. The power imbalance on the ground rendered many peasants skeptical of knights' supposed nobility, viewing them instead as threats to everyday survival. Historical records show how often knights strayed into lawless behavior. Some acted like territorial strongmen, blurring the line between nobility and criminality. In border regions or during civil unrest, groups of armed retainers behaved more like warlords than disciplined soldiers. Local knights sometimes resembled raiders, exploiting instability to extort communities and enrich themselves. The consequences for peasants could be devastating. A widespread rebellion in France, the Jacquerie of 1358, erupted when noble abuses reached a breaking point. Peasants, angered by extortion, heavy taxation, and the violence of knights, rose against the nobility. The revolt was brutally suppressed, with mounted knights slaughtering rebels and burning villages in reprisal. The uprising, though crushed, revealed how deeply ordinary people associated knights with oppression rather than protection. The church itself recognized this darker side of knighthood. Religious councils tried to impose rules like the peace of God and the truce of God, designed to restrain knightly violence and protect non-combatants. The very need for such measures shows that knights were widely feared, and often beyond control. The ideal of the noble knight may have existed, but it was more a hope than a reality, born from attempts to civilize men who otherwise lived by the sword. In essence, the knight's daily reality was shaped less by honor and more by obligation to his lord and the demands of feudal order. They were administrators, collectors, and warriors rolled into one, but rarely the gallant figures described in later literature. For peasants and townsfolk, knights could be symbols of power, yet also of brutality and injustice. They maintained a system built on hierarchy and fear, ensuring loyalty through intimidation as much as through loyalty or faith. Rather than imagining knights as paragons of virtue, it is more accurate to see them as armed pillars of feudal control. Their swords enforced taxes, their presence maintained obedience, and their power, both real and symbolic, helped keep the rigid medieval order intact. Far from being noble heroes, knights were often instruments of dominance, feared as much as admired. Number 2. The myth of chivalry. Chivalry is often presented as a tight code. Honor, mercy, loyalty, defense of the weak, refined love for ladies. But the term itself originally meant things pertaining to horsemen. It was first a social and military identity, only later dressed up as an ethic. In practice, the ideals were uneven, debated, and frequently ignored. Lords expected results: land held, taxes collected, enemies subdued. Knights lived inside that pressure. When justice clashed with advantage, advantage usually won. The Church knew this, which is why movements like the Peace and Truce of God tried to fence knightly violence off certain days and protect non-combatants. Those campaigns were moral first aid, not proof of a serene moral order. If knights had reliably upheld compassion and restraint, there would have been no need to preach restraint so insistently. Literature helped build the shiny veneer. Courtly romances and chansons de geste were entertainment with an agenda, elevating elite behavior and encouraging warriors to imitate polished heroes. But those stories moved in the opposite direction of most realities. Real campaigns demanded chevauché systematic raiding to burn barns, seize livestock, and starve fortresses. That strategy punished peasants first. Protectors of the weak often rode at the front of the torchlight. Even inside battles, the ethics were contingent. Knights celebrated the laws of arms. But those customs primarily served the interests of the mounted elite. Nobles might spare nobles for ransom because it paid. Common infantry rarely found such mercy. On days when danger or logistics tilted the scales, even noble prisoners could be killed. Pragmatism trumped sentiment. Tournaments, supposedly chivalric showcases, reveal the gap between ideal and reality. Early melees were closer to controlled brawls than polite sport, with injuries and deaths common. Over time, rules and pageantry thickened, yet the purpose remained social capital. Display wealth, test mettle, network with power. The ritual language colors, devices, vows made violence look civilized without always changing its substance. The rhetoric about women deserves similar scrutiny. Courtly love praised a distant, noble lady. Real marriage among the elite was a property arrangement, hammered out by families. A knight might sing devotion to an unattainable lady while negotiating a match based on acreage and alliances. Respect for women in the abstract coexisted with harsh realities of guardianship, wardship, and constrained consent. The mask and the face didn't align. Religious framing didn't guarantee gentleness either. Crusading vows were meant to sanctify arms and channel aggression outward. On the ground, they produced the same messy mixture of faith, ambition, and opportunism that marked warfare at home. Knights could be brave and pious, yet still sack cities, seize goods, and slaughter civilians when commanders or circumstances pushed in that direction. The holy label changed the justifications, not the mechanics. Regional differences complicate the picture, but don't overturn it. In fragmented polities where royal power was weak, retinues sometimes slid toward private war and extortion. In stronger monarchies, kings used chivalric orders, highly staged communities of honor, to bind nobles closer and turn the language of virtue into political glue. In both settings, chivalry functioned as management, an aspirational script to make dangerous men legible and, ideally, more controllable. Crucially, chivalry's most complete formulations are late. By the 14th and 15th centuries, treatises laid out what a knight ought to be, as if to fix a problem that had never been settled. These manuals mention mercy, truth, defense of the church, proper conduct in war, but the energy spent defining the ideal hints at the gap between prescription and practice. The louder the rulebook, the shakier the custom had been. Technology and institutions widened that gap. Professional infantry, disciplined archers, and eventually gunpowder reduced the tactical dominance of heavy cavalry. As battlefield logic shifted, chivalric bravado became riskier and less decisive. At Agincourt, for example, pressing forward into constricted, muddy killing grounds was not noble but catastrophic. Armor still mattered, skill still mattered, but the system that created the knight's prestige no longer matched the system that decided battles. When the battlefield stopped rewarding the mounted elite, chivalry's ethic leaned even more toward theater. Heraldry, pageants, orders, and tournament culture flourished precisely as the old military edge dulled. The moral language survived because it served other purposes: legitimizing rule, smoothing aristocratic hierarchy, and marketing the ruling class to itself and to onlookers. That doesn't mean chivalry was mere hypocrisy. Ideals matter, even when broken. The expectation to keep oaths and honor safe conducts did restrain behavior at times. Ransom customs did spare some lives. Sanctuary norms did sometimes protect non-combatants. Knights read devotional books, funded chapels, and tried selectively to live up to what they were told they should be. But these were islands in rough water. The myth, as popularly remembered, suggests a coherent moral universe with predictable outcomes. Protect the weak, honor the lady, keep the oath. The history shows a flexible toolkit, deployed or discarded depending on advantage, command, and fear. If you want to understand chivalry as medieval people experienced it,